They laughed before she even set down her basket. Minnie Slade heard them the moment she stepped off the side alley and onto the main boardwalk of Caldwell Flats. 3 men lounging outside the feed store, boots propped on the rail, hats tipped low against the morning sun. One of them made a comment she did not catch, but she caught the laughter that followed it, sharp and mean, the kind that had a target. She kept walking. She had learned to keep walking. Her left leg dragged a half-inch with each step, a reminder of the wagon accident that had taken both her husband and her steadiness in the same winter storm 4 years past. She had a brace now, leather and iron fitted by the saddle maker for $2 she still owed. It helped. Some days it helped more than others. This was not one of those days. She set her basket on the upturned crate she used as a stall, just outside the milliner's window where Mrs. Garrett allowed her to stand. 8 loaves, wrapped in cloth, still warm from the oven she had fired before sunrise. She had risen at 4. She had kneaded dough with hands that ached in the cold. She had done it because there was no other way to keep the roof her husband had built over her head. The oven alone was the warmest part of her morning, and she had long since made peace with the dark hours that came before the bread. The loaf price was 8 cents. She had sold 2 yesterday. She straightened the cloth over the bread and waited. A woman passed without looking. A man in a good coat glanced at the bread and glanced away. The feed store men were walking over now, and Minnie kept her eyes on the street and her chin level, because she knew what came next and she would not give them the satisfaction of a flinch. The tallest one stopped 3 feet away. His name was Dub Reese, and he owned half the livestock pens at the south end of town and spent what that earned him on whiskey and cruelty. "How much for a loaf, Limpy?" He made the word a coin he flipped at her feet. She said the price, 8 cents. Reese looked at his companions and grinned. 8 cents for bread from a woman who can barely stand up to make it. He shook his head. "I would not feed that to a dog." She did not answer. Answering was losing. One of the others reached out and flicked the cloth off a loaf, not to buy it, only to touch what was hers. She pulled the cloth back gently. Her hands did not shake. She had learned that too. She had spent 4 years teaching her hands not to give anything away. "Ought to go home, widow," Reese said. "You are embarrassing yourself out here." She heard the boardwalk creak behind them. Heavy boots, slow and unhurried, the sound of a man who did not need to hurry because he was already whatever he was, and the world would wait. Creed Walker had ridden into Caldwell Flats 2 hours before, looking for nothing more than a livery and a hot meal. He had both, and he had been walking back toward the hotel when he saw the woman at her crate and the men around her and the particular configuration of their bodies that he had spent 20 years learning to read. He had seen it from 30 feet. He kept walking toward it. He was not a tall man, but he was wide through the shoulders, and there was something in his face that made people step back before they knew why. A scar ran from his left jaw to the corner of his eye, a pale ridge that pulled slightly when he moved. He wore a long duster the color of dust itself, and a hat that had survived more weather than most buildings in this territory. The pistol at his hip was old and well kept and sat in the holster like it had been born there. Reese heard the boots and turned, and whatever he saw in Creed Walker made his grin go a notch smaller. Creed walked past the men as though they were fence posts and stopped in front of the woman and her bread. He looked at the loaves. He looked at her. She had dark hair going grey at the temples and eyes the color of river water in winter, and she was watching him with a worriness he recognized because he had put that look on a great many faces over the years, and he did not like seeing it on hers. "How much for the lot?" he asked. Her chin came up. She had been braced for a 4th man joining the others. She recalculated him in 3 seconds, the way a careful woman had to. "All 8 loaves." "All 8. She told him the price, 64 cents. She was careful not to make it a question. He pulled a silver dollar from his vest pocket and set it on the crate beside the basket. Keep the change, he said, and began lifting the wrapped loaves one by one and setting them in the crook of his left arm. She picked up the $1. Her hand had gone steady again, which surprised her. He turned then, 8 loaves stacked against his chest, and he looked at Dub Reese and the 2 men behind him. He did not say anything. He simply looked at them the way a man looks at a door he has walked through 100 times and is not impressed by. The silence held. It held longer than Reese was comfortable with. Reese tried to hold the look and did not manage it. He looked down at the boards. "We were just moving on," Reese said. "You were," Creed agreed. They moved on. Creed set the bread back on the crate. All 8 loaves. He had no use for 8 loaves of bread. He had bought them because they were hers and she needed the sale, and he wanted those men to understand the arithmetic of the morning had changed. She was watching him with the river water eyes. "You cannot eat 8 loaves," she said. "I cannot," he agreed. He leaned against the milliner's post and looked at the street. "You could sell them again. I would buy them again if the same trouble comes back." She almost smiled. It was a careful almost smile, the kind worn by a woman who had learned the cost of trusting a thing before it proved trustworthy. That would be a peculiar arrangement. Most useful arrangements are. They were quiet for a moment. Down the street a wagon rolled through. A child ran past with a hoop. The morning went on around them as mornings do, indifferent to the small turning that just occurred between 2 people on a worn boardwalk. "Minnie Slade," she said. "Creed Walker." She had heard the name. Most people in the territory had heard the name. She looked at the scar and at the old pistol, and at the steadiness in him that had not moved an inch when Reese turned around. She thought about 4 years of keeping her chin level and her hands from shaking and her roof over her head with no one standing beside her. "There is a bench by the livery," she said. "I sometimes sit there at noon when the bread is sold." He nodded once. "I will be there." The rest of the morning passed. She sold 6 of the 8 loaves to other customers before noon, proper sales with proper coins. 2 she kept in the basket because she thought she might bring them to the bench. She was not sure why she thought that. She thought it anyway. He was already at the bench when she got there, hat on his knee, face turned to the sun. He looked different out from under the hat, older in some ways, younger in others. The scar caught the light, and she found she did not look away from it. She sat beside him and set the basket between them and unfolded the cloth on 1 loaf and handed him half without asking. He took it. They ate without talking, which was its own kind of conversation, the comfortable kind, the kind that did not need to be filled. A sparrow landed near the basket and looked at them hopefully, and she broke off a piece of crust and set it on the ground. "You have been here a long time," he said. "Not a question." 4 years. She paused. "My husband is buried on the East Hill. I stay because it is where he is." Creed looked at his hands. "I have not stayed anywhere in 20 years. What has kept you moving?" He thought about that for longer than most men would have. "Nothing worth keeping," he said finally. She understood that. She did not push at it. She had learned that grief wore many coats, and a man like this had likely buried things that never got a marker on the East Hill. He stayed 3 days. On the second morning he stood at her crate again, not to buy bread, only to stand there, and Dub Reese crossed to the other side of the street when he saw him. On the 3rd morning Reese did not come to the boardwalk at all. On the 4th morning Creed Walker brought his horse around to the milliner's and tied it to the post, and helped Minnie carry her basket out from the alley. He did not make a production of it. He simply took one handle of the basket because it was heavy and her brace was hurting, and it was a sensible thing to do. She let him. That evening he asked if he could come back in the spring, when the trail work let up. She said that the bench by the livery would be there. He said he had a notion to look at land east of town, that he had heard there was a small parcel with a good water source and a house that needed work. She said she knew something about houses that needed work. He said he supposed she did. He rode out at sundown, the duster catching the last of the light. She stood on the boardwalk and watched him go, and for the first time in 4 years the space beside her did not feel like a wound. It felt like a door left open. It felt like a man who had given his word and would return to keep it, steady and unhurried as boots on a boardwalk, not because the world would make him, but because he had decided. That was enough. That was, she thought, everything.